Namaskar. Welcome to the 17th episode of the Indian AdGeek. My name is Vishal Mehra. Today on the show, I'm joined by someone who has made a career out of challenging the very language of branding. Anant Sharma, CEO of Matter of Form, has never been shy about calling out lazy marketing tropes, especially the word luxury. Instead, he champions timelessness, positive friction, and design that makes us pause. From heritage icons like the Savoy and Mandarin Oriental to Indian giants like DLF, Anant has helped brands navigate the tension between craftsmanship and digital transformation. In this conversation, we will explore why timelessness beats luxury, how agencies can win pitches by slowing down, and why imperfection might just be the new premium in this world driven by AI. Welcome to the Indian AdGeek, Anant.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Anant, what drew you into the business of luxury and branding? I say that very carefully, considering your anti luxury stance. I've seen and read your thoughts on it. What pushed you away from early career steps into founding Matter of Form and staying focused on experience design?
Wow, it's been a fairly haphazard journey, if I'm to be very honest with you. Um, when I started the business, we were a very, very different company. We were really a digital product business. And my interest in digital products, I'll explain, and then I'll tell you give you the abbreviated version of our various different lives. I studied journalism, and since was always being a kid, I was very interested in both computers and very interested in design. And I was always fascinated by magazine design. I used to buy all sorts of magazines, I'd collect them. I basically just loved beautiful editorial, right? And so I just loved the tactility, words on page. I loved reading. I loved the art direction within great magazines. I loved the evergreen editions that you felt you could reread. And I spent a lot of my youth just sort of reading and collecting magazines. I found it a really interesting path into understanding culture and just different topics and themes. And so I always ran magazines, little hobby projects since a young age. And it allowed me to exercise my interest in writing, but importantly, it also developed within me an interest in graphic design. So I had computers and was engaged with computers perhaps more than my peers. Right? And bear in mind that, you know, I'm 40 years old. And so when I was growing up, I, computers grew with me. The internet was like a thing that was invented when I was, you know, probably 10. It was, there was, the CompuServe, which is how you access the internet, was something you bought in a box from PC World. And then via a modem, if you were lucky, you could get a text version of your horoscope. I sort of entered the working world at this point in time where interface design was becoming really interesting, right? The Mac had suddenly appeared, right? And it changed how we thought about graphical user interface, right? Suddenly it went from something that was fairly, Windows NT, Windows 3.1 were not exactly an exercise in sort of graphic magnificence. They were fairly functional ways of interacting with the computer. So I became interested in human-computer interaction. The mobile was just beginning to emerge, but not really. E-commerce was becoming more of a thing, and digital platforms were beginning to disintermediate industries. And so my love of content, my love of design, and my love of technology came together, and I started a digital agency in an era where many advertising agencies were trying to become digital, but were doing a very, very poor job of it. They were looking at digital as this little add-on, this like technical gimmick that could be, um, part of a campaign idea rather than a fundamental change in how we thought about process and how industries connected with their customers, right? Entire industries. So There's a bit of context. When we started, we were a digital product company, and I used to take sweat equity positions in startups. I used to incubate them and built a little portfolio of ventures. We had a development office in Noida, and the cost efficiencies I would invest in these businesses. And the first third of our life was doing that. So we're a 16-year-old company, and for 3 or 4 years at the beginning, we would work with entrepreneurs and help them bring their ventures to market, their apps to market, their digital platforms to market. I would read business plans every week. Sometimes clients would ask us to build things, and we would keep the intellectual property, and we would build small teams to operationalize those ideas and turn them into new ventures. And so over the course, we built maybe 7 or 8 ventures that we had a stake in, and 2 or 3 of them turned into proper ventures, and I can talk about those later. We started doing innovation for larger organizations, and those larger organizations weren't that innovative, actually. So the innovation turned into transformation. We were really helping brands digitize. And I was quite young at this point, right? I was in my mid to late 20s, probably mid 20s. But because digital was still innovative, people were willing to trust us with their .coms. Right? You probably wouldn't go through a brand transformation with an agency run by a 25-year-old, but you probably would run an innovation program with someone that young. I mean, now innovation means something quite different, but then it was like, oh, the website, the add-on. And so we did a lot of digital transformation projects. We grew to almost 100 people at this point, doing big CMS builds. And, I started focusing also on e-commerce. And the reason for that was it's far easier to bill people for something that they make money from, right? And the level of digital illiteracy was it was a highly illiterate environment. Sometimes I'd be procured by someone in PR, other times I'd be procured by someone in IT, and the range of questions they would ask to get projects over the line would vary from the absurdly naive through to the ridiculously technical and almost impossible to answer. It's a very, very difficult business model to pitch. Now, during that period of time, we also started gravitating towards luxury brands. The reason for this was that we were just all quite empathetic and brand sensitive, right? We loved working for clients where we loved the product and we loved the service, right? We're less likely to win a project for an e-commerce site for a double glazing business and far more likely to do it for something sexy in the world of fashion because we were young and we were like, it made us proud, right, to work for these brands. And we were also quite brand sensitive. And so, unlike other digital agencies who typically were blunt instruments, they would come in and they would talk about conversion, they would talk about implementation. We also understood that digital really is a scaffold for content, right? And through digital user experience processes, you had to prioritize what was important in your business and what was less important. Your departments had to, work between themselves to figure out what the content hierarchy needed to be, how you actually talk about yourself now you're exposed online in a way that was focused and didn't just change from one person to the next. And that requires a level of brand consulting, which came naturally to us. And we didn't bill for it, but we were doing it. And we had to do it in order to reach a point where we could deliver the sites effectively. That was stage 2. Stage 3 was a realization that digital was becoming slightly commoditized. And so, sort of before COVID, a couple of years before COVID, I looked around me and we built a social media agency. We'd built a systems integration company that delivered e-commerce sites for many high street retailers, Karen Millen, LK Bennett, the Rug Company, Shanghai Tang, great retailers. We also then had Matter of Form, which was doing CMS websites and digital experience and UX and apps. And then we had Diffusion Digital, which was our performance marketing, Shopify, and small web build business. So we tried to capture every part of the value chain. And I looked around, it was sort of before COVID, and I thought, this is probably a bit of a mess. We're trying to do too many things. And to try and capitalize in the value chain, we've made too many other businesses. And digital is becoming commoditized. And our relationships with our clients are slightly strained. And I'm not the process guy who's going to turn this 100-person business into 1,000 people, which is when you truly start making money from these big transformation programs. What excites me is innovation, and not delivering innovation in the armpits of an organization, not making an app for someone in HR who wants to use streaks to maybe get his team to perform slightly better and then will eventually lose interest after 6 weeks when you realize what it takes to make an app. What we want to be doing is applying our innovation mindset at a brand level, at a business model level. And so we went on a journey to become a brand consultancy, which is scary, right? When you're delivering $1 million digital RFPs and suddenly you decimate that pipeline and start pitching for, fairly small 100 grand brand consulting projects, which you have limited experience in. But that is exactly what we did. We started pivoting the business. We started moving it into brand-led engagements. And that brand lens would allow us to then think about content, to think about user experience, to think about brand, all of the branded artifacts that you would expect, the collateral design, all of those things that I used to once turn my nose up at. And more latterly, things like sensory design, rituals, basically how the whole brand experience is imbued with the spirit of its promise. So that was kind of stage 3, and it was a journey to make that transition brand-led CX. Now, through all of this, we avoided calling ourselves a luxury consultancy because, frankly, I was never that passionate about the world of Hermes scarves and handbags. But I've always been driven by craft, quality of engineering, quality of just a desire to lead a category, not necessarily win by commercial scale, but win by edge. And so, we didn't call it luxury. We used to call it timelessness. We would define timelessness as 3 things: companies with a strong founding spirit. The second, companies who think long term. Right? The third was those who saw design as a point of competitive advantage. That was our definition of timelessness. That was our definition of the brands we worked for. We avoid using the word luxury until I started at one point almost accidentally a podcast called What the Lux. I mean, it's named What the Lux almost as a joke. You can tell it doesn't take itself too seriously. And it's been a huge success, actually. We've had guests that have ranged from the CEO of Kersner to the Jumeirah to Aston Martin to Bentley to Christie's, the president was on it, to it's got an amazing list of people. But the most downloaded episode is still the first one, which is called Why I Hate the Word Luxury. And it struck me that we had enough luxury experience to have the credibility to stand against what I believe had become a lazy and staid term, right? Luxury used to be about comfort and convenience, right? That's kind of what luxury means. It's about comfort and it's about convenience. All luxury brands originally tried to innovate and provide convenience or great levels of comfort, right? Louis Vuitton had round suitcases that you could roll on and off your horse and cart, for example, right? They all strived to do something that was unique and different, and they all had a maverick spirit underpinning their general business ethos.
That's a very impressive journey, Anant. Matter of Form began with a clear point of view on timelessness. How has that point of view evolved since you started the consultancy?
Listen, I think we're entering a crisis of meaning in the world. And the reason I think we're entering a crisis of meaning is I think it's best described by the meme that perhaps many of us have seen, which is like a woman complaining that AI isn't doing our dishes, but instead is doing our art. Right? I kind of want it to be unloading my dishwasher, not doing my creativity for me. Right? But we've ended up in this situation where AI is beginning to automate things that should be the preserve of humans with time, right? To make things, to express ourselves. But instead, we're using technology to express ourselves on our behalf. Now, I think that's one thing that's happening. The second thing is that we are optimizing life through technology, right? And by doing that, we're stripping out the serendipitous interactions that once were part of everyday life, right? Whether it's having a relationship with your shopkeeper or whether it is simply going and socializing on a Friday with your work colleagues. Now you might be working remotely on a Friday. So I think luxury has it was an excuse to take the irrational path. Right? It's a reason to slow down and engage in the environment you're in. It's a reason to connect with other people who engage in that experience with you. And actually, it's placing value on your own time to buy into a story, to associate with something that holds a level of symbolic meaning, and to indulge yourself, right? And through doing that, connect with things that actually used to be every day, but we're losing a little bit from everyday life.
Anant, you've been vocal about your distaste for the word luxury, calling it lazy and static. We are in the first month of 2026. Do you think the industry has finally started to move on from luxury as a catch all marketing term, or are we still stuck giving consumers those badges of honor?
I think there are a couple of things going on with this. The first is that luxury has become like a search term. Luxury has become a way of sifting IKEA out, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so often I think it's a bastardized word. I mean, it's just used and thrown around by everybody. Whether you're buying a 1 pound chocolate, $1 chocolate, 100 rupee chocolate, or a $1 million penthouse, everybody
E-
uses that.
Exactly. It's just become a way of denoting we cared about quality when delivering this. But any shade of quality within that definition has become blurry. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is I think globalization and digitization have exposed many of the larger luxury conglomerates for what they are. They've exposed supply chains that now betray the craft upon which their businesses were supposed to be based. And it's why Hermes retains so much value because they've been so stubbornly puritanical about their production process. It's more important than ever for the supply chain and the provenance and the skill that goes into making something to actually be part of the narrative and part of the brand experience. And a lot of luxury brands have undermined what they stand for and the craft that they champion um, for a quick buck, right? And they can enjoy that today because those luxury brands still um, carry gravitas and status, but that runs out very quickly, right? That how we express our status is fickle and will become even more fickle over the course of the next 5 to 10 years.
This next question is very fascinating to me, especially in light of what you have said in the past about it. In a digital world that we live in now, obsessed with seamlessness and zero click conversion, you have advocated for positive friction. It sounds a bit bonkers to me, making the customer work a little bit for the reward. Can you tell our listeners why adding difficulty to a user journey might be the smartest branding move for a premium brand?
Benjamin Franklin once famously said, if you want someone to like you, ask them to do you a favor, and they'll post-rationalize they must have liked you enough to have done you the favor to begin with. We basically like to ensure that there is a congruence between our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Now, in a very noisy world, it's easy to default to a bit of a shout louder mentality. Right? Let's just shout louder and get noticed and get people to buy our product by influencing thought. Get people to feel something by influencing thought. But it's far more effective to get people to do something, to actively engage in a two-way relationship. And if you can get them to do something small, they'll change their belief system to support their action. It is what cognitive behavioral therapy is based on. It's like get people to move in the right direction, right? It's what streaks are based on, et cetera, et cetera. So the point with this is if you get people to just convert without engaging, they'll suffer this it's a concept of buyer's remorse, right? And actually 67% of people suffer a level of buyer's remorse when they buy something one click. Because there's no journey, there's no story, there's no narrative, there's no healthy friction between them and what they've done. They've just, of course, listen, this is relevant in the world of luxury. If you're buying toilet roll from Amazon. I don't want friction. You know, let's be honest.
Yeah.
So
No, so can you give me an example? Like I said, it's very fascinating. Can you give me an example of how, let's say, I'm buying a luxury Hermes scarf?
well, I mean,
What kind
Hermes,
of
okay, if you brought up Hermes, they, I mean, you can't even apply to own a Birkin bag without already having bought enough Hermes product. I mean, that's like a very crass, heavy-handed example of friction. It's so bad that there's an antitrust case against them in California, because it's so ridiculous, because it's kind of ridiculous, but it's almost sort of on the point of like, they're blackmailing people into spending enough money to then spend more money. But listen, my point is, I think this principle, if you let's take the other end of the spectrum, we create these sort of one-click websites, but actually it's more effective if someone um has to sort of go through a bit of a content funnel before they can buy the thing. They're warming up and becoming a better customer or a more engaged customer by engaging with bits of content. So I think it's important to measure like engagement with things that signify that people understand and love the brand, right? As much as it is just getting them to check out.
A few weeks back, I was talking to this gentleman, Brent Rivard. He runs an agency called Geezer, which has a very interesting way of working. It only employs professionals who are 50 years and above. And his take on this is that if you're selling, let's say, a $50 million villa, a 25-year-old copywriter probably won't be able to get inside the head of a 50, 60-year-old prospective buyer like someone with experience can. Where I'm going with all of this is simply standing back and looking at how our cultural cycle has shortened to 15-second micro trends, right? Whether that's a micro drama or a micro film or whatever. Is it possible for a brand to be timeless without becoming irrelevant to the Gen Z alpha consumer?
People fundamentally don't change as much as we think they change. I think that if you're a fast moving good and you appeal to like the impulses or the everyday, then I think it's probably important to be culturally relevant and to be up to date and to have a Gen Z strategy. And of course, you've got to think about future customers and their belief systems and their value systems and the world they live in. You've got to understand those things, right? But and you've got to understand the things that then the fundamental drivers of trends. But I think you've got to look at that you've got to look at the drivers, not the trends themselves. Because if you try and chase trends, you'll very quickly end up in a race to the bottom, in my opinion. And you become outdated as quickly as you feel you made yourself relevant by jumping on that thing. I also think the trend cycle is, yeah, I think it's interesting to try and unpick what is a trend and what is a fad and what is culture, right? And when does a fad become a trend and when does the trend just become culture? And um, I always spend a lot of time like thinking about, okay, how do I categorize this phenomena or this change in, behavior? Because we're not changing that much, but we definitely are changing a bit. And there are things that are here to stay that are going to reshape how we interact with the natural world and how we interact with each other. And so, that's culture, that's not a trend. Do you know what I mean? So it's what I'm really trying to say with all of this is you've got to separate the things that are happening with the things that relate to behavior, like truly relate to behavior, and not just the stars in people's eyes and what excites them today, but rather what is changing their existence.
And that you think would be universal across age groups, whether that's a Gen Z consumer or a slightly more older consumer.
I think it's fairly consistent. Um, I think it's fairly consistent, but it's not fully consistent. That we live in a different, I live in, I'm 40 years old, I live in a slightly different world to the people in my company who are 25 years old, and my belief systems and values are different. So there are differences, but my point is people too often make it about the channel that they're engaging with the audience in, or they think the differences are like that there are superficial differences and there are fundamental ones. And the fundamental ones are the ones that are important to look at, I think, when you think about a timeless strategy or a strategy that, is about brand building and not just about conversion.
Hospitality is a sector you of course take a lot of interest in, right? And if you look at the Indian market, massive boom in terms of boutique and luxury hospitality. I don't know if you're following this new brand called Postcard Hotels. They've been doing so. You just look them up. They've been
Okay.
doing some really interesting work. The gentleman leading it is ex Oberoi, so you would expect a certain kind of class there. Now, my what I'm getting to is we were talking about heritage brands about 10 minutes back, right? And
Yeah.
you had your take on it. Now, imagine if you were advising a new Indian hospitality brand launching and would you tell them to lean on uh, into royal heritage, the Rajasthani palace trope, and all that, or
I would.
completely
I
avoid
would
that?
because I would because I love it. And I think it's a beautiful expression of Indian design. And I think that we're trying to modernize India in a way that's not true to actually its roots. And I think that's a really wonderful aesthetic that I personally like. But what I would advise them is who are you after? What is who is your target market? Do you have a clear sense of the psychographic profile that you pursue? And how do you then design something that consistently lives the promise that you deliver? So what is your brand? And how do you then live that through design? And that's an annoying thing to advise, but that's what I'd advise because too often people, what is the aesthetic? We all like different things. So who is it that you want to come into your brand experience? Where are you located? And how do you find symbiosis between the context where you are and then also like the culture that you want to represent and build? So that's another annoying response to your question, but it's like the simple response is I'd go down a beautiful kind of, contemporary Rajasthani, but with nods to the past vibe because I think it's beautiful. I think it's a lovely version of India that I think should be preserved and updated and brought into hospitality experiences more.
Yeah. Hmm. Okay, so from historical figures, Anant,
Hmm.
let's talk about the future slightly. Yeah, everyone in our business has spent a large part of the last year or so talking and integrating AI into their business. Uh, that has made content cheap and unlimited, really. So do you think that would make human imperfection, kind of premium? How does a luxury brand justify its premium pricing when its marketing collateral would look like everyone else's AI output?
Yeah, it's the impossible to answer question. I wrote a talk for the UK luxury body, which I gave about 2 years ago, and it was called On Wabi Sabi AI and the Future of Luxury. And it was a play on the Japanese concept of wabi sabi. Sure, most people will be familiar with the concept of it, but the real point of the talk was that all beauty lives in imperfection, right? That's almost the soul of a thing, lives in, the irregular stitching, that proves that it wasn't made in a large factory in China, but hand stitched, in a stable in France. Or, the beauty lives in the DJ mix that's a bit out of time, but you just know that he's or she is mixing, you know, truthfully rather than just with a sync button. The um, practice of lomography, which is a cheap Russian-made camera that was badly made. It used to let the light in through the sides. It would create this bizarre bleached, color-infused print that people fell in love with because the beauty of it was just this terroir almost lent to it by this badly made camera. You know, J.J. Abrams, when he filmed Star Wars, filmed on 35 mil. Right? He cited the inherent perfection of the computer generated model
Yeah.
as the reason,
So did Nolan for Batman Begins, I think.
really.
Yeah.
But there you go, right? So you have, this expression of humanity, um, and it lives in the things that prove that we're human. I think, like, I spoke earlier of a crisis of meaning, and the truth is that um, we're going to start having to ask ourselves what we really value. Why do we? There's a company called Loy Loy. They 3D print antique rugs. It's like, what are we really buying when we buy a rug that looks like it's purposely faded, that looks like it's like a synthesized antiquity? You know, what we're human beings will always value the blood, sweat, and tears of other human beings. That's just the truth, right? We value the efforts of others because that effort represents sacrifice, it represents focus, and it represents a skill honed through patience and commitment. And that is ultimately what is valuable to other human beings. That's why we love something that's hand stitched. That's why we love a Nepalese rug. That's why we love couture that's not made en masse in a factory. And of course, other dynamics play into our desire for things that help actualize ourselves, like the scarcity of a thing and the uniqueness. And, someone once said every act of consumerism is an act of self-expression. And of course it is. For those who perhaps don't have the deft artistic hand to express themselves on their own, we do it through the things that we buy and the things we adorn ourselves with.
And broadly, what kind of design trends are you foreseeing in the year ahead?
I mean, a lot of the work we're doing at the moment is sensorial design. So we're looking at how do you think about all of the senses and how they come together within experiences. So most luxury brands we work with, if they're retail brands, they're thinking about the experiences that surround their products. And if they're hospitality brands, for example, they're increasingly thinking about the role they play in delivering joy and what that means in a world that, is digital, and so we're thinking about sensorial design. We're also thinking about things like neuroaesthetics, like, how can the, salutogenic design, like how can the design of spaces, enhance feelings of well-being, for example. So those are the sort of things that we're looking at. We are using the opportunities we have where what we do exists in a physical space to think about sound signatures, think about how frequencies can reshape emotional dynamics in the way that light can change the intimacy of an environment, thinking about the impact scent can have on memory and recall. It actually has the more powerful impact on memory and recall than any other sense. What is branding if not memory and recall? So those are the sorts of things we're looking at. We're a business that was founded on user experience, and we believe that user experience doesn't have to be limited to a two-dimensional laptop screen.
Hello, before we move on, just a quick reminder to so many of you who listen to the show but do not subscribe to it. Please do press the follow, subscribe button on whichever podcast app you're using. Back to the conversation with Anant now. Anant, you've worked with Indian real estate giants like DLF. Do you think the Indian definition of premium is evolving differently from the West? In the West, quiet luxury is quite a trend. You see it everywhere, you see it being talked about everywhere. But does the Indian market still demand loud signaling, or are we seeing a shift there too?
Look, I think it's interesting what's happening in India. There are about 100,000 high net worth individuals in India at the moment. So about 100,000 people who have a high net worth is defined as those who have about $1 million in the bank in investable assets, right? So it's number four globally. That's a big change from like a decade or two ago when I was growing up. Um, and that is going to grow. I think it's estimated by about 50% between in the next 5 years. So it's one of the fastest growth economies globally. And the affluent cohort, which is not just millionaires, is also ballooning, right? So I think consumer base of affluence can jump to about 60 million from 60 million to about 100 million. There's going to be like there's a lot of wealth emerging in India, right? And um, that growth is going to come from tier two and tier three cities, right? So, places that are not Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, that type of thing. Right? So it's going to be more geographically diffused wealth. It's going to create pockets of affluence beyond the like global elite enclaves, right? And it's going to impact taste and preference, right? There are going to be a lot of people spending a lot of money, you know, who have got very, very different taste to where we're used to wealth spending, which is this globally connected set of cosmopolitan cities, Mumbai, Delhi, London, Paris, New York, LA, Hong Kong, Tokyo. These cities are connected, and in a way, they have a sort of transferable taste profiles. So it's a very long way of answering your question, but we're going to see spending in ways that probably proud spending that wants to make a point around wealth, that will probably be a more ostentatious and more signal orientated driver or motivation behind the spend.
We started our conversation with how you pivoted Matter of Form from a digital production shop to a brand strategy consultancy to a design consultancy. If you were starting a consultancy or an agency from scratch today, would you still build it the same way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. It's funny because when you start a business, you are very practitioner focused. So we had lots of designers and no account managers, and then you go the other way and you end up with a lot of account managers and no like the ratio of actual talent is a lot less. And you become like a client service business. And then eventually you find the balance that works for you. Right now we're not a huge business. We're about 50 or 60 people, and we're fairly evenly balanced between various design disciplines and consulting and growth. I probably would have doubled down on luxury earlier. You know, I I was I I really think that, you know, I think that luxury is, it's because it represents craft as a company, as a creative services company, working with businesses that already value craft and the care in the product. It just makes life enjoyable. You know, you're not just manipulating people into buying more Mars bars. You know, you're not you're not trying to turn a commodity into something that, you know, feels different deceptively. You're working at products that are genuinely beautiful products. You're trying to unlock the story that already exists within them and find new ways of telling a story that you believe in. And that's really fun. And the hospitality industry, which is one of our key sectors, is a really fun, culturally diverse, interesting sector to work in. If I was going to start an agency today, I would probably focus on wellness and a more sensory and a different forms of design that are less about brand or digital and more about spatial design and wellness and neuroaesthetics and salutogenic design and interior. That's probably the form of design agency that I'd start today. When I started it all like 15 years ago, it was about user experience and how users move through innovative digital experiences. And today I think we need to be innovative with physical spaces. We need to think about how users move through physical spaces, because I think there's less reason to move through physical spaces and we need to encourage people to engage physically.
Most CMOs are under pressure to deliver hyper personalized AI generated campaigns at warp speed. You pitch timelessness and friction. How do you win a pitch when your strategy requires the client to slow down while your competitors are promising to speed everything up for, I don't know, half the price?
Listen, I try and quantify everything I talk about in a conversation centered around risk and value. when you're working with a client or pitching to a client, you have to understand what the risk of them either not doing something or doing it badly is to their business and what the impact of getting it right is. Right? And I know that that sounds almost stupid and how simple it is, but it's very easy when you're delivering a pitch to forget how it's actually going to change the company and perception of the company and ability to drive up price point or ability to reach new audiences or enter new markets or decrease costs or have happier employees, or how does it actually impact the business, what you're doing, and what is the risk of not getting those things right? And that's just central. That's to remind yourself of those things, I think creates a good pitch.
Does that make you look arrogant?
I don't think so, no. I think it makes you look like you understand the context into which you're delivering.
According to you, what is the single biggest mistake agencies or consultancies make in their pitch process that might cost them the pitch even when they have the best creative idea?
I think agencies tend to talk about themselves too much, number one. Number two, I think um, often agencies' ideas aren't rooted in commercial context.
Hmm.
And I go back to what I spoke about earlier. They don't identify the risk and value of various ideas working or not working, what it actually means for point three, the customer. And being really user-centric, being really customer-centric, and you know, actually voicing insight through the customers, speaking to customers enough before a pitch, I think is really important as well. Helps break your own biases a little bit as well. Um, so those things are really important. I think delivery strategy is often missed. People talk about the ideas and they talk about the creative strategy, but they often miss the, you know, commentary around how they're going to approach delivering that piece of work and the considerations that are unique for the client's company, right? Like what kind of stakeholder environment are you working into? How global is the business? What are their technical constraints? What are their physical constraints? Et cetera, et cetera. I just think that's often missed. People talk about delivery in a functional way, but they don't talk about delivery strategy enough.
So, how do you pitch yourself when matter of form walks into a pitch room? How do you go about your business?
Well, look, we try and start by talking about the client, right? So, but that's not to say we don't talk about ourselves. We have to. But I'll give you this anecdote. In my previous office, when clients came in, they'd walk into a beautiful kitchen. Right? We had it was like a sort of like like a sort of kitchen of a high-end restaurant. It was a beautiful ex-architect's office. It was a stunning place to walk into. Now, my mandate to my personal assistant at the time was to leave the clients in the kitchen, and we had a beautiful counter that you sat on with stools, a suspended Corinth counter. We'd leave them sitting there for 10 minutes so that they could absorb the vibe of the other people milling in and out of the kitchen. And we'd give them a book of our work, which we used to print. We'd call it our retrospective. We'd print one every year, and it would be beautiful and tactile and nicely bound, and would have all of our work beautifully, um, represented, right? With a short form, just a caption under each beautiful image, right? That just spoke about the impact statement of the work. And we'd leave them there with the book for 10 minutes, and we'd invite them into the room. And by the time they came into the pitch room, they'd already know our work. They wouldn't be questioning our credibility. They'd know our clients. And it stopped us having to talk about ourselves, which you spoke earlier about arrogance. That's the thing that comes across as arrogance, not talking about risk and value in the context of the client's business. That comes across as respectful. When you understand your client's problems and the fear they have around the change that's about to happen, this varies, by the way, for every business. If you're delivering creative campaigns, it's one thing. If you're delivering brand level business transformation, it's another. If you're delivering user experience or digital product or a website, the risk is different. So, but you've got to remember, like, what do they wake up worrying about every day? Right? What what are their big questions about how they're going to look if this project goes badly? What other things will it impact within their organization? Right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So And I just think you just sometimes forget that companies aren't faceless entities. They're built of people who wake up with dreams and fears. And so thinking about the client persona as much as the, client's customer's persona, I think that's really important.
All right. Anand, describe a pitch for me that you might have lost, but maybe taught you more than any win. What did you change in your mindset or matter of form's mindset afterwards?
Look, I think when we started, we're a business that grew from nothing, and I'm a founder CEO as opposed to a career CEO. So I built a business with a challenger mindset. I was always having to prove myself, right? And so as we developed more and more and so when I started, I was very good about talking about the client. Okay, I was good about talking about the client's problems because in a way I needed to deflect from the fact we had very little experience. We had no relevant case studies. We didn't have the right examples that I could put up on a screen that showed that we had certain digital skill sets or that we had sector experience. We just had to prove ourselves through an understanding of our client's business. Okay. And our proposals were simple and they got to the point and they spoke about the client, not about ourselves. But as we started accruing more and more experience, I started thinking that that was the thing that was important, right? Talking about all of the other amazing clients we've worked for, talking about our amazing proposition, talking about all these great people that we'd finally hired full time, talking about the awards that we'd won. The list just started growing longer and longer. And before I knew it, we were spending half the pitch talking about ourselves and not enough time talking about the client's challenges and the client's problems. And I realized at a certain point that we just spoken at a major client for about 45 minutes and frankly asphyxiated them in the room. And I had this sort of out of body moment where I looked around and I looked at, how unwieldy this deck had become that was just, is just a is 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 just a demonstration of our own ego. It was our tail feathers. And at that point, I just realized something needed to be done. Now, of course, you've got to talk about yourself, and of course, you've got to talk about your experience, but we were in a midway point at that point. So we were still small enough and unknown enough that we had to prove ourselves. Not like an Ogilvy going into a room where everyone knows who Ogilvy is, or a publicist company where everyone knows who's behind you. You've got that mark on the bottom of your deck. You don't really have to talk about, you know, what all of the things that you've done, even though you still do, of course, but perhaps more contextually to the client's problems. And so at that point, I did a few things. I realized the clients needed to know about us, but it was better for it to not be in the pitch room. They needed to be warmed into us and know about us before they got to the room. Now, again, we didn't have big marketing budgets. Like today, we publish so much thought leadership. Most people have already heard of us and know about us before they come in the room. So I did a couple of things. So the first time I came out of this sort of hole where I realized we'd spoken about ourselves too much, we were pitching for a major hotel group. And the first slide was called the $50 million missed revenue opportunity. Now, at the time, we were very digital and it was a UX brief. It was basically like a small CRO brief for a hotel company. We'd noticed that their conversion rate was, let's call it 0.5%. And I can't remember what it was. It was like 10 years ago, but let's call it 0.5%. And we'd figured out that, the industry average was 2%, and then we'd halved it for luxury to 1%. And then we'd looked at their global revenue and worked out actually that the differential was worth that amount. And that's how we starting pitches. And that is much more powerful than telling people how many campaign awards you've won.
What an interesting and effective way. Anant, I've read that you are philosophically opposed to selling time, but in a tight market, procurement departments love rate cards, right? And hourly breakdowns. How do you operationally structure a value based contract without the client feeling like you're pulling a number out of thin air? What is the metric, if not the R?
Value and risk. You're looking at what is the value you're creating for the client. You're looking at what is the risk of getting it wrong. And
But,
then
but how are you telling them that?
by framing conversations in that context. I think the $50 million missed revenue opportunity is probably quite a good example of it. Right. Now, listen, I want to say something about this because it's not always possible to not sell time. It really depends how commoditized your proposition is. And this is a big issue the industry is currently facing. We all know there've been 4,000 layoffs the other day in Omnicom. The WPP share price has got problems. That there at the end of the day, a lot of what we thought was really valuable has become commoditized by AI. It's hit the unexpected part of the value chain. It's hit creativity quite hard, aspects of it. So if what you're selling is commoditized anyway, you'll always be just another block in a Gantt chart, right? And then you will be competing on rate and you will be delivering deliverables, right? But if what you're doing is providing a red thread that allows clients to see in the context of their wider market what their business is. And you are the red thread that joins together many disciplines to then frame what you're doing in the context of commercial value. It does become you then start pricing things, in the context of like value and risk, growth, or the cost of not doing something, the cost of not moving, the cost of not changing. Do you know what I mean? Like if you pay a no fees, no claim, no win lawyer, because you got knocked over on a zebra crossing, there's the concept of jaywalking. I don't think is a concept that exists in many countries, but except perhaps New York and London. But the point I'm trying to make is, people care very little when what they're paying is a cost of actually an upside. Right. And so your job is to figure out what is the greater upside? What is the business context in which you're operating? And trust me, you can change the psychology of a client from thinking about the same service set as simply a set of downstream deliverables to something that completely changes the headaches they have in their day-to-day life, changes the things that cause them deep levels of stress and keep them up at night, and something that allows them to frame the work that's been done to the board or to their CEO or to their manager in a way that is like definitively valuable to their company and hence makes them look good in their job role. And it is a mindset shift and it comes with maturity. Of course, it also comes from having access to the right stakeholders where you are thinking about growth holistically rather than simply, deliverables that have to be done because, that's, what's been asked of you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, staying on that, my next question, my follow-up question is, are you looking to restructure your pricing model
No,
to
we've been value pricing for years, so we cost things and we price them and they're different. And listen, when we moved many years ago from digital, which is very delivery focused, into brand, which is, you know, which is naturally value based, right? Like, Coca was it Nike paid $2 for their logo? I think that was in Shoe Dog, wasn't
it
it?
wasn't, yeah, but it wasn't
No,
$2,
no, it
but
was
it was a
maybe
very
it was
nominal number. Yeah,
it was something, or maybe there was some story. Anyway, whatever. We
few thousand
Nike
dollars, but yeah,
a
very
couple of
minimal.
$1,000. There
Yeah.
was a company, there was a major company that paid even, I can't remember, maybe who knows who it was. Anyway, it's irrelevant. You can pay $1,000 for your logo, or you can spend, 100 million like Coca-Cola or whoever, I can't, And I think maybe Pepsi spent a huge amount, I can't remember, but a lot of people spend a lot on their logos. The
Well,
the
they
point
do.
is
Pepsi does it every what, 7 8 years.
something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
But I suppose my point is, what are you selling? I mean, of course, you're selling a visual identity, you're selling strategy, you're selling, a set of subtle shifts in how you wish to be perceived. And and those, if you get wrong, can tank a business. And if you get right, can create exponential value. So you're doing something that could be done in a day intuitively or could be really researched, and that might only change the output by 2%, but that 2% makes all the difference. So suddenly you're not selling grunt work, you're selling acumen, and you're selling an ability to figure out what homework needs to be done to make the right decisions. Right, the job of a CEO is to make simple decisions that are well informed. Now, those decisions might take a day to make, but you choose how much rigor needs to go into each of those decisions. And brand is like that, and all forms of consultancy are like that. So,
Yeah,
so
right.
the simple answer really is it does depend what you're selling, you know, but you can always be a little bit more value orientated about how you talk about what you're selling, and that impacts the psychology of how you're bought.
What's the single biggest shift you're anticipating in how brands need to think about customer experience and brand positioning in the next 3 to 5 years? What should forward thinking agencies or brand consultancies be doing now to prepare?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are happening in the world that are sort of fairly obvious, but I'll state them anyway. The first is downstream creative assets are increasingly going to be um, it's easier to make them with AI, right? And we actually have a curriculum and have helped clients and have charged, like 30, 40 grand a piece, to actually help AI train in AI or create in-house creative studios. Now, I don't think that's going to disrupt like the really important brand assets or, the really like the things that are critical to like how the business communicates itself. But I think it's incredibly valuable for more downstream aspects of how a business communicates. Like I always joke with our clients that, you know, you might think an email template is irrelevant, but that's where value is born or broken. You know, for you, that's just an irrelevant downstream design asset. But actually to your clients, if you communicate incorrectly in that, you know, seemingly fairly minute touch point, it can have a drastic impact on the paradigm of value. And so I think that you can use AI to create more consistent copy and more consistent design assets. And actually, it can elevate the whole experience. So I think everyone needs to be thinking about that, both agencies and brands. I think businesses in general need to be niche. They need to understand what their promise is and how do you imbue the spirit of that promise across every touch point and just not being everything to everyone. I know everyone who who wears a brand hat probably says the same thing, but it is incredibly important. Right? When you buy into a brand, you're actualizing a certain aspect of your personality, right? And I want to see that promise consistently delivered across the experience. So I think that's really important. And I think it's very important in a world that's become very noisy with millions of options and everyone is just bombarded with things that ultimately create an opportunity cost to the decisions they're making. So be really, really targeted, be really, really focused on what your promise is and how you deliver it across the whole experience. Do it with consistency.
Do you think there's anything else that agencies need to do to remain relevant?
There's a lot that I think agencies need to think about, let me put it that way, over the course of the next year or two. We're going to see a big shift. The middle is going to be fairly disrupted, I think, of agency world. Um, and
Sorry, what do you mean when you say the middle of the agency world? You mean mid-size agencies or something else?
I mean, agencies in the business of production. So non-strategic agencies who make stuff.
Like
Um,
sweatshops, in a way.
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use those terms, but yes, body shops. Yeah. Agencies who sort of the goal is margin per head and the profit is realized through scale. And that goes for digital as much as design, as much
Right.
as downstream advertising as well, actually.
Yeah. So your point is that to remain relevant, agencies need to think and act more upstream than downstream, of course. Is that it?
Yeah, yeah, I guess which I think you need to be upstream. I think you need to understand like your clients' businesses and how their business will grow through what you do. And I know that's a huge, it's like, it's a patronizingly basic thing to say, but I think, when you're in the business, you can forget it.
Yeah, there's a divergent point of view on that which I have discussed with few people. I've been told that agencies need to take care of and understand the consumer, not the business as much, because agencies will never be able to reach an extremely high level of understanding of the business due to so many factors. But where agencies can add value is the deep understanding of the consumer. Would you subscribe to that thought?
Look, I think that's very fair. Look, I'll say two things that I think are absolute laws to live by. One is, do you know how your clients make money?
Are you
And not
asking me?
no, I'm not. I'm it's a provocation to those listening. Do you understand the actual business model? And because two clients in the same sector might make money in very different ways. That impacts their org design, it impacts their culture, it impacts their priorities. You have to understand how your clients make money and what their business model is. The second is you have to jar them out of their own biases and provide them with an outside in perspective of their customer. It's fine to take rote what the CEO says in the boardroom, but you need to balance that with the truth that the cleaner knows about, and so, or the person standing behind reception, or floor staff in a store, and so voicing what you believe the future is through their eyes, that's where the insight lives. And that's something that it's hard for AI to actually give you a good insight on. AI gives you average things, which when you start unpicking, you're often left with nothing. Like, of course, that will change and things will become better the more data there is, and the more developed the models become. But actually, there is nothing like the sort of human insight you get from just talking to people, because it's not just about what they say, it's about what you feel from them when you're talking to them. It's about body language. It's about a sort of unspoken truth that exists in the interview. And so we always make a point, I always joke with our clients, our job is to bridge the ambition of the boardroom with the truth of the cleaner. It's like somewhere between those two things is how can we move the business forwards, but also what is actually true of the customer. And that customer is always messier and always a little bit humbler than the CEO might like to imagine.
Where do you see the biggest white spaces for agencies today and tomorrow? Capabilities brands will insource versus those that they will continue to hire out.
This is where my expertise is, so it's what I believe is valuable. But I think that customer experience is valuable for a couple of reasons. There are deep challenges in CX because it spans departments. A customer moves across all of your departments as an organization, right? But companies tend to be structured in marketing, product, PR, operations. A customer moves across all of them. And so CX naturally creates briefs for other challenges that relate to culture, org design, content, service design, creative comms. And your job is to link all of those things together in a way that an organization is not fundamentally set up to do. That is valuable. We're in the business of behavioral economics at Matter of Form. So when we're thinking about customer journey, we try and rationalize commercial growth through the lens of behavioral economics, and that gives credit to what we're doing at a brand level. How do you deliver emotion, and what are the building blocks of that? Is a question we ask ourselves when we're working on working on CX.
You lecture to MBA students on brand strategy, on customer experience and innovation. What's the most common blind spot you see amongst the next generation of brand leaders, Anant? What do they need to unlearn?
Let me be clear here on the remit. So I teach a couple of modules of the MBA at EHL in Lausanne, which is in Switzerland. It's a hospitality management school. So actually, the people I'm teaching are like in their 40s. That in fact most of them are older than me. So they're not really the next generation of brand leaders. They're people who are already fairly well equipped in the industry and are sort of looking to change from maybe local market roles into head office roles. And yes, I guess they are the next generation of brand leaders. You're right, because they're maybe moving from operational roles or local market roles, like I said, into, you know, roles that have a global remit, and that's their reason for doing the MBA. Maybe their businesses have sent them on the MBA and that type of thing.
What's the blind spot you see in them?
Well, I'll tell you. So one of the things we do is we deconstruct a brand and we rebuild it in a hospitality context. So we might ask ourselves a question like, what would what how would Dyson show up in hospitality? I guess you probably everyone knows Dyson, right? The Hoover business. And so you break down Dyson into its molecular components, and maybe you're a Hoover company. maybe you're about air quality, maybe you're about, maybe you're a Dyson hotel would offer cryotherapy and the perfect location would be in an airport, right, where you can rejuvenate. Maybe it would be a business hotel that would be in an airport that would stop people on short visits having to travel into the city. These types of like, lateral thinking, right? It's very fun exercise. And then we rebuild these businesses and then we create a plan and then, it's financially modeling. Basically, we create a business case for why Dyson should go into hospitality over the course of a week. And it is extraordinary how difficult people find it to think creatively in days 1 and 2, and how poor the presentations are, and how quickly they evolve into exceptional creative storytelling presentations where people are able to break down these walls. They're just stuck in these operational. All they will say is, well, that wouldn't be possible because this, or that would never happen because of this. They just sit there staring at a blank page. Actually, it's weirdly, it gives me quite a lot of confidence when I do it because I realize what feels quite intuitive and comes quite naturally to all of the people in the room at Matter of Form, and I guess in our industry more broadly, people really struggle with. It's a reminder, like actually what we do is like might at times just seem quite intuitive, but actually people really struggle with it. People struggle with creative thinking if they're not been. You spend 20 years of your life in an environment that doesn't encourage creative thinking, and it's all about spreadsheets and operations and how things work and making them happen, but without having the autonomy to think about how they might happen if you thought about them differently from the ground up. And you get stuck in that mindset. So it's very, very educational for me, actually.
What's your approach to mentorship inside the consultancy? How do you like to train your young team members?
Well, we own a design thinking school called Experience House. And so, um, anyone is entitled to take courses for free. There are things like UX, product management, design thinking. I believe a lot of the skills you learn as a user experience professional should actually be brought into the boardroom. And I think those human facilitation skills are actually vital in business today. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have an MOF university program where we have amazing lecturers come in on a monthly basis and talk about everything from the design of scent through to the design of SOPs. So we get really good rounded information about other areas in the world of business and in the world of design. The third is, of course, we have our podcast, What the Lux, which people listen to and enjoy, and that gives a good rounded experience of the business of luxury. Um, and we, of course, also, by the way, invest in R&D on projects so that we can learn things. We do talks, they force our thinking to stay fresh. I go and do a lot of talks, but so do the team. We teach, we lecture, all of these things, they sharpen your own thinking as much as being able to impart a bit of knowledge. There's no better way, as the old adage goes, there's no better way of learning than teaching. So we do all of that kind of stuff. And then one of the things that has been really interesting is we actually have started running an occasional internal podcast called Know Your Client. And our clients will come in and talk, and we record it, and it's confidential just for internal purposes. They will talk about their business model. What is their job? What do they actually do? And it's astonishing when you realize what people on the other side of the table actually do. And it's a really good reminder to our team that we are not their everything. A lot of people in advertising and marketing think they don't really know what the client's doing the rest of the time. They get annoyed when the feedback doesn't come in at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. I mean, when you really understand some of the challenges that our clients are going through and what they need to think about on a daily basis, and you have that Chatham House rules conversation with them in person, it changes the context into which you deliver your work, and it's fascinating.
That
And so
is
that,
so fascinating indeed. I just want to spend a minute more on that. So, you invite them to your office or you do it at a certain location, you're recording that, and that recording is only for you and the client.
yeah,
And
yeah.
what kind
We
of
had the head of
questions?
we had the head of strategy from Jaguar Land Rover come in, right, for example.
Right. So,
And
what kind of
when they
questions are you asking?
when they were in the middle of like, some all that tariff stuff in the US, and they just launched their new Jaguar and they were having a really tough time. And we ask pretty searching questions. Normally the client lead will interview them, and it'll be live to the room, and we'll have the whole team in there and we'll record it. And And we have very smart clients. We're very fortunate, that, and we have good relationships. They really like us. And they'll come in and talk to us. And, you know, the complexities of an OEM, you know, of a hardcore manufacturer of cars, you know, is but people don't really understand what it takes. Like, for example, right, the design cycle from actually designing something to manufacturing it is like 6 years in automotive, right? And so yeah, I mean, that's the lag that you're dealing with. Okay, you've got a bunch of blue collar workers, working in a factory making a Range Rover. Uh, they don't really like the people they're making the car for. They just think that they're like overprivileged. So you're dealing with all of these challenges. You're trying to think and feel like a luxury brand, but what is luxury? Is luxury just an Hermes handbag? That's very different to what an OEM does, etc., etc., etc. And so there are all sorts of cultural challenges. There are all sorts of business model challenges, supply chain challenges. You know, threats from like like a good example in cars is the reason that battery operated cars still have a drive shaft going through the middle is because it takes too long to change the body, to change the chassis, right? And it would take too long to change it. So they've to redesign the battery to fit in the drive shaft. But of course, there is no drive shaft in a battery operated car. All the wheels are just independently powered. It's actually just a tin can with a battery on it, and the wheels independently operate. So my point with all of this, and obviously Jaguar is owned by Tata, so I think, isn't it? Yeah, or yeah. So it's those sort of things. I'm not going to go into the detail of it, of course, because it's all confidential, and this stuff's like fairly public. But those are the sorts of challenges that you really get into, and we're all in mutual confidentiality anyway with our clients. So it's fine to have these sorts of open conversations, and it makes our work much better.
My final question for you, Anant. Do you have any podcast or book recommendations for our listeners? There is, of course, What the Lux, but anything else that you enjoy and recommend?
This is going to sound absolutely ridiculous, but I don't listen to podcasts at the moment. I it I literally I spend so much time having to audit the What the Lux episodes that I just sort of, and do you know what's funny? Like I record the episodes of What the Lux, and I sort of like I don't really. It's quite hard to listen when you're recording them in a funny kind of way. I do listen. I'm like actively listening. I've become a much better listener as a result, but I'm like not really absorbing the information. So when I re-listen to them, I'm like, this guy is fascinating. But I've just been, you know, you're like trying to carry the energy, right, when you do a podcast. And so it can be quite, I find it much easier being a guest on a podcast than doing one, by the way. So, and I think you handle it very well, by the way. So credit to you. But, but and so I enjoy listening back to them because I'm amazed by the things the guests have said that I've just sort of actually not picked up on as much as I ought to have in the moment. So I spend time listening to those. And then listen, we had the head of behavioral psychology at Oxford University on one of our recent episodes, and he's called Charles Spence, and he's wrote a book called Sense Hacking. And this book is about how you get people to feel differently by combining senses and hacking the senses. And for me in luxury, I thought that was very relevant. I think it's also very relevant in the digital world where actually we need to start thinking about physical experience more.
Thank you so much, Anand, for being so generous with your time and for this detailed conversation together. Listeners can look forward to hearing and seeing you regularly on What the Lux podcast. I'll have links in the show notes.
Thanks, Vishal. It's been a pleasure, and you do a very good job of your interviewing. So, congratulations on it.
Anand has reminded us that timelessness is not about resisting change, but about designing experiences that endure beyond trends. For our listeners, I hope this sparks new ways of thinking about branding, experience design, and the future of agencies. Until next time, keep questioning the obvious and keep building for timeless impact. Next Sunday, the Indian AdGeek will have the Director of Marketing at Boeing Business Jets, Chris Schindel. It is going to be a Wings India 2026 special. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with someone who might enjoy it. The Indian AdGeek streams on all major podcast apps. Anant is not active on X now, but I am at Vishal Mehra everywhere. Hit me up with your feedback. Until next time, keep your creative antennas tuned and your AdGeek flag flying high. Stay quirky, stay curious, and keep geeking out.